Thank you very much. I would like to reconvene our meeting. Next, we will proceed with our interview for Mr. Shackelford. Good evening, welcome, and thank you for being with us here today. Following the interview questions, you will have the opportunity to make some concluding remarks. We've had the opportunity to review your resume in detail. Please tell us how your experiences and qualifications have prepared you to be the next superintendent of Walled Lake Schools.
Thank you, and good evening to each and every one of you. Good evening to the community and to those who are watching. I want to say this up front. I've been in your buildings a couple times, Walled Lake Central and Walled Lake Northern, because my girls are into dance competition. And so in the last couple years, I've spent quite a bit of time on Saturdays in your schools. And I will say, if you've ever been a part of those competitions, it's all day. And so I have snuck out. I've walked through your buildings, and so I'm very impressed. So let me just say that up front. I didn't, I tried to be respectful, but I did walk around and look. And so I was very, very impressed with Walled Lake. And so about me, I am born and raised in Mount Clemens, Michigan. I'm a proud battling bather. After graduating, I went off to the University of Michigan, graduated, and I started teaching in Detroit at Henry Ford High School. Did that for 2 years, and then I moved north to Southfield Lathrop. I was there in Southfield for 11 years. After about 8 years, I was tapped to become an assistant principal at Thompson Middle School. That lasted for a year, and let me just say, during my teaching, I thought, I had a cousin who was the first lawyer in our family, and I said, I want to follow in his footsteps. So I decided to go back to law school. So I was teaching during the day, going to law school at night. And so I was finishing up. I finished up in December. I got tapped to become a superintendent. Wishful thinking. I got tapped to become a assistant principal in July as I was studying for the bar. I was 1 month out from the bar, actually a couple weeks out from the bar. And my principal came to me and said, hey, I want you to become my assistant principal. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I'll just continue to study for the bar. And then next year, I will go ahead and I'll take it. Well, the next year comes around. My principal called me on during the week in the summer. And he said, superintendent's going to call you. She's going to offer you the principalship at an elementary school. You're going to say yes. Okay. And 10 minutes later, she called, and I accepted the principalship at elementary school, Fred D. Leonard Elementary School in Southfield. And so I said at that point, okay, I'll have an extra year to study for the bar. I'm going to ace it now. And then I got there, and I absolutely loved being an elementary principal. Loved the babies. They loved me, and made some great connections with some families there. So much so that in 2 years, the district needed to downsize. And so superintendent came to me and said, Mr. Shackelford, we're going to turn Bernie Middle School into a K-8. We want you to go over and facilitate that transition because the parents will feel comfortable with you, with their babies over there with you. Okay? And in the meantime, we had a university high school, and so the idea that I proposed was that we needed a university middle school. That made sense. So in the middle of transitioning that K-8, we also created the university middle school that's flourishing right now in the old Southfield Lathrop. And as life would have it, my wife and I reconnected. Well, we actually shouldn't say we reconnected. We grew up together, but she went to school in Florida. I stayed in Michigan. Through the power of Facebook, we reconnected, and we decided to get married. And so I had a choice to make. What am I doing? Is she coming home, or am I going down to sunny Florida? As you can guess, I made the decision to go down to sunny Florida. And so I looked at that as an opportunity. I looked at it, I'd never lived outside the state of Michigan. So I looked at it as an opportunity to expand my horizons. So I went down to Jacksonville, Florida. I worked in Duval County Schools. I always tell the story. On Monday, I was a principal. By Friday, I was a vice principal at Nathan Bedford Forest High School. I was there for 1 year, and superintendent came and said, I want you to be the principal at a middle school there. And so I did that for about 3 years, and then my wife and I had our first daughter. I made the decision, and I'm very proud of, and I love talking about this, to be a stay-at-home dad. I had children later in life, and I wanted to experience that. And so my wife agreed, and so I took some time off, and I became a stay-at-home dad. Couldn't do that long because I'd done a lot of turnaround work in in Jacksonville, and so I had a call from someone in Boston, and they wanted me to come up and work in one of the toughest schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the only vocational technical school in the city of Boston. And so I decided to take that leap and go to Boston and to be the headmaster of Madison Park Vocational Technical High School. A very interesting experience. Very proud of the work that we did there. But July, I accepted a job. My wife had twins later that month. So we made the decision that my wife would stay in Florida. My mother-in-law would go down and stay with her. And we made that work, and then we moved up to Boston a year later. But we realized we had 3 under 3 in the big city. Didn't really work for us. We wanted to come back home, and we did. We came back home, and I've been working in Port Huron for the past 5 years. And the grandparents absolutely love having my 3 adorable girls. In fact, my wife is working, and so Granddaddy's watching them now. And so that brings me to you here because I feel like my experiences, my varied experiences, has prepared me to be the superintendent of Wall Lake. I've looked at your criteria. I went and I checked every box and said, this speaks to me. And what really spoke to me, I think it was one of the last bullet points that you guys had, and it said the undying love for children. And I can guarantee if you go to Port Huron and talk to any of the parents that were in my school, they will tell you, Mr. Shackelford loved our children. And the reason why I know that they would say that is because every day at the end of every announcement, I would tell them, I love you. And so, and I talked a little bit about, having that being a stay-at-home dad. That really changed my perspective because when I lead thinking about my own children. I lead thinking about what I want for my kids. And whatever I want for my kids, the kids that I serve, the community that I serve, they're going to get it as well. And so that's where that undying love comes from, and that's what I have. And so that's why I sit before you, and I sit before you knowing that this would be a good fit for you and for me.
Thank you. Our next question will be asked by Vice President, Mr. Siegler, and then we will proceed in order from there. Mr. Siegler?
Good evening. Please share an example of a time you have led a sustained multi-year improvement initiative. Be specific regarding the situation, the task at hand, your specific role, and the outcome.
Yes. So I talked about going to Boston, one of the toughest schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I happened to be in the airport flying up to Boston, and I was talking to a gentleman, and I told him what I was going there for. He heard of the school, and he just said, ooh. And so that was the reputation. That was the stigma that was attached to that particular school. So as I told you, I got there in July. By November, the Commonwealth had determined that this school would be a turnaround school. What does that mean? That means that I had to lay off the entire staff by January 30th, and only half of them could come back. I had to create a 5-year turnaround plan, and we focused on 4 areas: collaborative leadership and shared leadership, intentional instructional practices, student support, and school culture and climate. So we had to do that. So I had to pull my team together. Now remember, I'm the new guy. the new guy from Florida that's coming in, laying off people who've given their lives to that building. It's a very important building in the heart of Roxbury. I could look out and see the Boston Police headquarters behind us. This particular school was on Mayor Walsh's platform. So imagine having to go sit into, you're the new guy from Florida. You have to go and sit in Mayor Marty Walsh's office and talk about this school because this school is important to him. And so I had to pull my team together. We wrote a plan. We had to lay off all the staff members. We had to give everyone who wanted an interview back, an interview that wanted to come back, we had to give them an interview. And then we had to make the tough choice of not bringing half of them back. In addition to running the building and doing all of the things that you have to do to maintain a building. We put the plan together. We focused a lot on instruction. Our academics was not where it needed to be. It was a unique school. In the 11th and 12th grade, we had about 19 vocational programs, and so in 11th and 12th grade, you did 1 week on, 1 week off. You did 1 week of academics, 1 week in your vocation. And so our kids were really focused on the vocation, so of course our numbers did not look the way that we wanted. So we spent a lot of time on multi-tier systems of support. What does that look like? What does Tier 1 instructional supports look like? What does Tier 2, Tier 3? The population was about 50% Hispanic, 43% African American, 3% white. And so in the Hispanic population, it varied from, from kids from Mexico, the kids from Colombia. So we had a large Cape Verdean population. And so we had a lot of needs in our building. And so what we did was we did put the plan in place. We did see some growth in the very first year. We had partnerships with the local community colleges, Roxbury Community College, Bunker Hill Community College, Wentworth, and they were all tied to our vocational programs. And the other thing that we did was we had the academic side and we had this vocational side, and we needed to bring them together. So part of the plan was integrating, because that makes sense, right? You have academics and vocational, integrate them. So what we did was we brought the math teacher and the shop teacher, the auto shop teacher together and said, let's design some lessons so that way when they come to you during vocational week, they've already learned about some of the concepts. And why don't we have the math teachers come down and teach that concept related to wherever it is you all are working on. And what I found that they never talked to each other. And so we really were able to really merge what we were doing, integrate what we were doing. That's just good practice. We worked on small learning communities. We really did put the focus on that, and we did see some results.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Secretary Mr. Peterson.
Tell us about your experiences maintaining a focus on student learning while also managing a district that is declining in both enrollment and revenues.
So obviously I've never been a superintendent, so I've never managed a district. However, I will say that particular example that I gave, we were unique in terms of Boston and being Boston Public Schools. We did not have to always, we were not seen as like the other schools. And so we were almost like a district within a district. So I use that example, but then I'm also going to talk a little bit about, I'd like to talk about my time as a building principal in Port Huron. Again, I took over a building that had a very negative stigma attached to it. The scores were not as high as we expected them to be. And so we took some time to really, and I used social media very effectively because I created a hashtag positivity campaign because I always think about starting with the strengths and the assets of our students. What do our students do well? What do our teachers do well? Let's start there and we'll build from there. And we had a great community. We had a great set of teachers. And so what we did was we've put the focus on common planning time. We created a schedule that provided common planning time for them. We created common assessments. We got new curriculum. I empowered my teachers to go and pick apart that curriculum and create common assessments. And then what we did scrimmages. Then we would give those common assessments. And then once we did that and got the data back, then we would sit down and have conversations in that common planning time and look at the data and then let that be our focus for the next 6 weeks. And we continued that process. And as kids continued to show growth, we would do things like call home. We had positive phone call campaign. And I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you how many calls I made where parents were actually, first of all, they were a little put off. Like, why are you calling me? And then when I told them why I called, I had parents who started to cry, or they got really emotional. And they would say, you know what? No one has ever called me and said anything positive about my child. And so, and other teachers started to hear that as well. And so what we did with that is we built a campaign around that because we were declining in enrollment. Our numbers were going down. And I think most schools the population is going down. But we used that, and we went out to our communities, and we talked to them. I always held town hall meetings. So I talked with them and shared with them, here's what we're doing. You're hearing about these scrimmages? Here's what we're doing. We have common planning time. We have common assessments. And so we went out at the end of the year, close to the end of the year, to all of our elementary schools. We had been sharing this all year long. And then once we got to the fall, we had completely reversed our projections. Now, our projection had us well below 800, and we were in our 820s. And it's because that we took the time to make put the focus on the academics, and we shared it, and we were positive. And then when I moved to central administration, we kind of kept that same, I brought that same mindset in terms of we really engaged our families. And so we leveraged some of our ESSER dollars to create a family engagement position so that way we could, again, create that same momentum and have that same process for the district.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Treasurer Mrs. Kaplan.
Using specific examples, please tell us how you maintain visibility and accessibility to the board, staff, parents, and community groups. And how would you ensure this happens as our next superintendent?
So again, if there's one thing I'm very proud of, and again, you could go up to Port Huron and say Mr. Shackelford's name, they will tell you, oh, that's the principal who stood out in the parking lot every single morning and every single afternoon. That was that was something that I felt was important. As we, as parents drop their kids off every day, it was important that they saw my face. And I even got to the point where I was opening doors and directing traffic. And if anyone knows about parent drop-off in the morning and in the afternoon, I became famous for that. I became known for that because every single day, rain, sleet, or snow, I had parents who had a grandparent who, for the 2 years she was with me, she would knit me a scarf and a hat. I had parents, we had that cold spell a couple years ago. They brought coffee because I was out there, because it was important to me. It was important that during the pandemic that we did Facebook Lives. I did a Facebook Live every Sunday night where I would have a PowerPoint and give them as much information as possible. They would hear my voice, they would see my face. I would even bring my family on. They wanted to get to the point where they wanted to see my wife more than they wanted to see me, which is fine. But they saw my children. I had to be human. I needed to be human to them. We also did Vimeo videos. So as students were coming back, we had some students coming back, some that were not coming back. So we did videos letting them know this is the school, this is what Schoology looks like. We did tutorials on those. We did a tour of the building. We were at their service. And that's what I became known for. And people would say, Mr. Shackelford, send another email. Mr. Shackelford's on social media again, because that was important. And so what I will bring to Walled Lake is that same energy, that same excitement. I love interacting with parents. I love interacting with the community. As you can tell, I think you can kind of see I'm getting excited about it, because that's what I love to do. And so with the board, will be an open line. You have my phone number. You don't like surprises. I don't like surprises. So I'm going to be open to you and available to you at all times. With the staff, I'll be in the buildings. I'll meet with the teachers. I want to hear from them. I want to hear their thoughts. What do they think we should be? What direction they think we should be going? To the parents, again, town hall meetings. I want to hear from them. I want to hear how they feel Wall Lake is doing, how we need to improve. What are some of the positives? What do they expect of me? How are they going to hold me accountable? I need to hear that. And then to the community, you're welcome. You're always welcome. You're invited into our buildings. I'm going to give you my 100-day plan at the end, and I use the theme, the culture of we. We as a team, we as a community will ensure that every child every day gets what they need, and we do it by being collaborative.
Thank you. Our next question comes from trustee Mrs. Dunn.
Tell us about a challenge you've experienced in bringing a diverse group of people to consensus on a difficult issue. How did you provide leadership, and what was the final outcome?
So, it's a good question. We have, Port Huron Area School District has taken on a Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Initiative. I came into the district, it started in the building a year prior. And one of the things that I noticed was that the staff that I had to stand in front of was not receptive to it. And the feedback that I received was that we're being called racist. And so I had to walk into that. And of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to me. And one of the things I always, when I tell this story, is I want people to understand, I want them to imagine that here I am, black man, the only black staff member in my building. And I have to stand before all of my teachers who are not black, who are not of color, and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and why it's important. And I had to sit back and I had to listen. Okay? I had to listen to them. I didn't talk at them, but I just listened. And as we engaged in those conversations, then they wanted to hear from me. And what I shared with them was, my name is Shawn Shackelford. My father's Donald Shackelford Sr. His father was Wesley Shackelford, and they lived in Mississippi. My great-grandfather, James Shackelford, was also from Mississippi. But the first record that I could find of him was in 1882, his marriage certificate to my great-grandmother. Before that, I can find nothing because he was born a slave. And I can maybe pinpoint slave owners with the last name Shackelford in Mississippi, and I can do the math and say, okay, maybe this is him on this plantation, male Shackelford, 2 years old, male slave, 2 years old. But that's all that I can find. And they were interested. And then I had someone tell me about their background. And then we started to have these great conversations. And then I began to explain to them, that's why it's important. It's important when you understand who I am and where I come from, and it's important that that I understand where you come from. And it's important that you understand where our kids come from. And when you understand that, there's a different level of respect that you will have. My superintendent now is Greek. He was telling me how he went back over to his village in Greece, and it's a small cemetery, and people in that village, they're all buried in that cemetery because it's so small that it's full. And so he said that when someone dies now, they have to exhume another body and then put the bones in a box. And he told me how he went and held his, I think, great-grandfather's skull in his hand. He took his son over. Yeah, and as morbid as that sounds, I enjoyed hearing that because I don't have that experience. That's not part of my culture. So when I heard that story, I had an appreciation for him and for his culture. And I Googled it too, and I just wanted to find out a little bit more about it. But that's where, when we have those conversations, and that's what we did. And I'll just wrap up and say we did a PD on microaggressions. And I think that's where the door just opened wide, because they began to understand that we all have a bias. We all bring those biases to the table, and sometimes they come out in ways that are unintentional. And it's not always about race. It could be about gender. It could be about a number of things. And they told me, said, out of all the PD that we've ever done on this subject, this was the absolute best. But it started with, I had to listen, I had to share, and I had to listen to them share, and we all understood. Now, did I win everyone over? Absolutely not. But again, I won a majority of them over that we were able to continue the work.
Thank you. Our next question will come from trustee Ms. Van Leeuwen.
Please explain opportunities you have had working and collaborating in diverse, multicultural, and inclusive settings.
So as I mentioned before, it's in Southfield. Southfield had and at the time had a large African-American Chaldean population. I learned an awful lot. My Chaldean students, I remember we had a cultural day and they brought in grape leaves and everything, and I had it for the first time. And had a declining but still sizable Jewish population. When I went down to Jacksonville, Florida, not so much. And as if you took note to the name of the school that I went to, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And at the time when that school was built, it was predominantly white. It's changed over to a predominantly black school. And so that name has been changed. But again, going down and having the experience of working in an area where you had, black students and white students, and it happened to be going to a school named after a Grand Wizard of Ku Klux Klan. Then I went up to Boston. Boston really blew my mind because the school that I went to, I saw kids walk through the halls. They looked just like me. But when they opened their mouths, they spoke a different language. And it was so interesting because one of my counselors came to me, and I believe she was from Haiti. And they were just trying to get to know me. And they said, well, where are you from? I said, well, I'm from Michigan. No, where are you from? I said, well, my parents are from Mississippi. She said, oh, you're American. Yes. You're I'm a regular old American. But the population was, as I stated before, was 50% Hispanic, 43% African American. But again, they came from all over. Sizable, and I didn't realize how much of a population of Cape Verdeans that they had. And so I had to ask the question, well, why do you have such a large Cape Verdean population? They said, well, if you look at Boston, take your finger, just go straight across. And there was the island. And so again, I learned so many different things. And it allowed me, in that particular instance, to really take a step back and not assume. Okay, not assume just because someone looks like me that they have the same culture, have the same values, and so that was probably the biggest eye opener for me. And so then I came to Port Huron, and it was flipped, where I have about 75% white and 25% students of color. And so as you could see, that I have a varied experience, and it's really taught me a lot. In my career, I took some things for granted. I assumed a lot, and so now when I go into these different environments, I don't assume. I want to engage. I want to know. I want to learn. Tell me about your culture. I think that makes you a better person, and definitely a better leader.
Thank you. Our next question will come from trustee Mrs. Casagrande.
I always seem to be the one where you need the water, so I try to take notes. And
I'm trying to take water after each one because
it's good.
I'm
It's all
excited
good.
and energized. So
I'm going to take a stab at saying your name correctly. So, Mr. Shackelford.
that is correct. Thank you.
Describe how you have engaged and affirmed all staff members, and please provide examples.
Actions speak louder than words. That's how you affirm them. You show them. You empower them. You give them support where they need it. It's not enough just to simply say, great job. You need to show them that I am here to support you. What is it that you need from me? And I'm going to tell a quick story. Like, the reason why I believe that is because that's what I experienced. As a teacher in Southfield, we were doing a lot of work with Rick DeFore, the DeFores in terms of common lesson plans and common assessments, small learning, professional learning communities. And so we talked a lot about wanting common planning time. So I went to my principal and said, hey, as a teacher, I said, I got an idea. All right, I think we can shorten our Mondays and then create some time for us to plan, and this is what we can do when we're planning, so that way we can give this to you, and this will be our lesson plan for the week. And so he looked at me and said, okay, if you believe in it, sell it to your colleagues. And then once you sell it to your colleagues, you got to sell it to the union. And then once you sell it to the union, you got to sell it to the central admin. So he put it on me. So I said, okay. And so that's what I had to do. So it was kind of intimidating having to stand in front of my colleagues and say, hey guys, I think this is a great plan for us. But they bought into it. And so I was made assistant principal the next year. And so I was able to implement that plan. And so what I learned from that is what he taught me was, and what subsequent leaders has taught me is that you have to empower people if you want to get the best out of them. And so that's what I have done in my career. And where I'm at now, I'm proud to say that there are 4 individuals in Port Huron schools who are in leadership roles because of how I empowered them. I had an assistant principal and my dean. My assistant principal, when I walked in, I recognized, why are you an assistant principal? You should be a principal. And so there were some confidence issues. So I said, okay, we're going to work on that, okay? And so what I did was I empowered him. And how I empowered him was I stepped out of the way. So I'm going to give you this, you do it. And he would come to me for questions. I had to tell him, stop coming to me for questions. Stop coming for answers. You figure it out. And he did. It took a while, and he did. Proud to say he's a principal now. I had 2 teachers in the building who aspired for that, to be an assistant principal. I empowered them as well. They became leaders in our building. They led our PBIS. They led our equity work. They are now assistant principals. I had my dean, who's now my director, and now in central administration. And they will all say that it's because of the work that we did together that they are now in administration. And so, again, you affirm them by empowering them, getting out of the way, and letting them work. And when they make mistakes, you sit down and you have conversations with them. You do it in a collaborative way.
Thank you. Mr. Shackelford, I have your next question. How do you go about making decisions on controversial issues? Please give an example of a controversial issue you have experienced.
So how do you go about making decisions? You get input. Well, let me first say this. As a leader, you take a step back, you breathe, you look to your people that are around you. So if I were the superintendent, I would look to each one of you, get your input, find out if it's a controversy for you. Why is it I need to hear your individual thoughts. Then I would turn to my cabinet and find out their thoughts. What are they hearing? Then I would turn to my building principals. And then once I've gathered all of that, take a step back once again, and then you have to make a decision. And that decision sometimes comes down to your own personal opinion. Sometimes you have to make a decision based on what's best for, you have to make a decision what's best on what's best for the district. And so, and I was listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago, Malcolm Gladwell's tips for changing a stubborn mind. Don't go into any decision with your heart set on, with your mind set on something. allow other factors to change your mind. And it's okay to change your mind. That's why I would come to each one of you. That's why I would come to my cabinet. That's why I would come to my building principals. And then I would take all of that, make the decision, and stand by it. And so, an example, so right after the January 6th events happened, I was asked to write an editorial, actually write an opinion piece. I was kind of leery about it because I had to be careful, because it was not an issue where I wanted to go on the record saying this is my opinion. But what I did was I consulted my superintendent. He thought it was a great idea, as long as I would run it by him first, the opinion piece first. So as I thought about writing that piece, I had to be mindful that I am a leader, and I had to be mindful that my parents are going to read it, the community is going to read it, my students are going to read it. So the approach that I took was I used what we were teaching our kids. And we were using a discussion strategy in our building called Talk Moves. And we talked about agreeing to disagree. I hear you, Mrs. Van Leeuwen. I hear you, but I respectfully disagree. I hear you, Mr. Peterson, but I respectfully disagree. And that's what we taught our kids. So as I wrote that piece, I talked about how this is a great opportunity to teach our kids to respectfully disagree, to have conversation, to talk to each other. So, of course, when it came out, there were people who were upset that I had the audacity to even speak about it. But once you read the article, I didn't take a side. I just talked about the opportunity that it presented our kids and what we can do and what we can teach our kids. And so, I stood by it. I stand by it today. And even another example, right after the George Floyd incident happened in Minneapolis, I felt it was important that I address it with my outgoing 8th graders. And so I did. And my goal was, again, I'm not pushing ideology, but this is an important time in our country, in our history. And it was important for me as your principal and as your leader to address this. Because my goal is, in 20 years, and I told them this, in 20 years, I want you to come back to me and say, Mr. Shackelford, I remember you addressing that. Now, whether they say, well, I totally disagree with you about it, but I appreciate you having the courage to address it. Or they may come back and say, you know what, you really made me think about it. And so it takes courage to step out and make those kind of decisions on controversial issues. That's what a superintendent will have to do. And so those are my examples. I'm very proud of them, and I don't have a problem ever in the future addressing them, but I will never address them without consulting others.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Vice President, Mr. Siegler.
Mr. Shackelford, please describe your knowledge and experience in using data to make informed decisions.
So I talked a little bit earlier about the process that we used in Boston. Talked a little bit earlier also about the process that we used as a building principal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we're using now, again, as in terms of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative. We just don't want to do this because it's the thing to do. We don't want to do this because it's a thing that we want to check off and say we're just doing it. And so what we're working on now is an audit. We need to hear from our community. We need to hear from our teachers. We need to hear from our students. We need to hear from our families. We need to know their thoughts around cultural differences, cultural bias, what's going on in the classroom, disciplinary issues. We want to know how kids are feeling in the classroom. We want to know how parents are feeling when they come into our building. And so we are in the process of putting together or consulting with a company to complete an audit for us and get that information back to us. And so that way we can use it to inform our professional development moving forward. To me, data is not judgmental. It just simply guides us. And so we want to be able to say, this is what our community is telling us. Even if they're telling us that we don't really want it, we don't really like it, we want to be able to hear that. We want to be able to have those conversations and use that data to move us forward.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Secretary, Mr. Peterson.
What does an effective relationship between the board and superintendent look like? And how do you cultivate such a relationship?
So, and I outlined this in my 100-day plan. We have to have an open line of communication. You don't like surprises. I don't like surprises. So if I'm superintendent, first thing I'm doing is I'm reaching out to each and every one of you. I'm going to take you out to lunch or dinner. I want to hear from you. I want to know what drives you. I want to know why you're on the board. Certainly, probably not for the money. It's probably because of your love of kids. Now, this was Los Angeles where you get paid, I think, $125,000. Then, yeah, you could say it was for the money. But it's not certainly for the money. So I want to know what drives you. Why are you sitting in that seat? I want to know about, as much as you want to tell me, about your families. I want to share with you about my family. I love my family, okay? I'll tell you right now, you can go to my social media, and you can look, you can see how much I love my family, okay? I want to share that with you. And I want us to be able to create systems, norms for board relations. I want to be able to know what you expect of me. I want to give you my 100-day plan. I want you to look at it. I want you to give me feedback on it. I want you to hold me accountable. I'm taking this job because I believe in I would be taking this job because I believe in Walled Lake. I believe in the children here and the community here and the families. And I want you to hold me accountable. And so tell me how you're going to do that. Tell me what you expect of me. Give me that feedback. And so I would want us to sit down and go on a retreat. I want us to have fun together. This is going to be a relationship that is so vital to moving this district forward. And so I'm going to make sure that I do as much as I can to make sure that each and every one of you are comfortable with me, and I'm comfortable with you individually and as a board.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Treasurer Mrs. Kaplan.
How do you gain support for and educate the community about our schools, specifically when faced with a controversial topic like redistricting or privatization?
You have to be as transparent as possible. You have to communicate. And I gave you some examples of how I've done that in my previous job and how I do it, how I continue to do it. What I have found is that the parents, the community, they love when you over-communicate. You can't get enough of information. So share what's going on. Share the process. Be open to feedback. Be open to people who will dissent and will dissent loudly. Be open for that. Be upfront. You cannot be afraid to hear negative or what you deem negative feedback. So if you are looking at a controversial topic like redistricting or privatization, you want to talk about why do we need to do this? Then you want to talk about a process. And obviously if you could talk about redistricting, that's not gonna happen overnight. So you're gonna have to sit down, I would have to sit down as a superintendent, look at all aspects. Have everyone come to the table from my cabinet and talk about why do we need to do this? How can we make this work? And as we're having those conversations, making sure that we are having those town halls, making sure we're keeping the community informed, making sure we're keeping our staff informed. And so that is how I will go about doing it. We have to make sure, and again, that is something that I pride myself on. I don't have a problem with sharing and being as transparent as possible. People learn to trust you when you are transparent.
Thank you. Our next question will come from trustee Mrs. Dunn.
Tell us what budget development process you use to gain broad support for the final result.
So I'm a part of the superintendent's cabinet, so I'm a part of the decisions in terms of how we go about creating a budget. Obviously, one of the things that we want to make sure is that we have money to always pay the bills. And so we have an outstanding business and finance person, and so she makes sure that we are making sure that our general fund is where it needs to be. We are making sure that we are leveraging grant dollars, whether it's the ESSER dollars or any other grant dollars, to take pressure off of the general fund. We are making sure that we are communicating with our building principals to see where they are and what their needs are. And ultimately, we are looking at our strategic plan and what the community has indicated to us is important. And especially, we got a lot of feedback from our ESSER feedback. And so making sure that we are putting the money where our community expects it to go and being as transparent as possible about that, about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so one of the areas, and I talked a little earlier about, is leveraging those grant dollars for that family engagement, because what that person has done, what that position has done, it has brought approximately 60 students, 60 families back into our district that were gone, and from conversations with them, they were not coming back. But for this person going out, engaging with them, showing them what we had, and now they're back with us. So we leveraged those dollars for that. We also, we were granted the Michigan State Police Competitive Safety Grant, and so we are using that for barricades on our doors in the fall. So we are looking at how we can, what's important, because safety was important. Obviously, in light of Oxford and Uvalde, that is on our minds. That is on parents, teachers. That's what they're thinking about. And so we are making sure that we're putting the money where they expect it, and also making sure that we are cutting as far away from the classroom as possible.
Thank you.
Yes.
Our next question will come from trustee Ms. Van Leeuwen.
It's been said that people either love or hate school negotiations. Would you tell us where you fall on that spectrum and share with us your negotiating experiences?
So I told you I have 3 girls and a wife, so nothing really goes my way, right? No. So we have to negotiate. You can't lead by it's my way or the highway. And so we have to engage the other side. We have to engage people. We have to have conversations. We have to see where everyone stands. And there may be times when you have that conversation, you see that we agree. But then when we don't agree, we have to have conversations about where can we make concessions. And so that's important to always, as a leader, to always, again, I talked about, tips for changing a stubborn mind. Being able to, even as a leader, say, you know what, I can move on this. This is not important. And being able and being persuasive enough to get others to see that we need to move in another direction, in a different direction. And so it's important to do that as a leader. My experience, so I talked about in Boston, as part of our turnaround plan, we had to negotiate with our 3 bargaining units, the teachers, secretaries, and our paraeducators. Now, obviously, we had, because it was mandated by the Commonwealth, we had a lot of flexibility as building leaders. So we could have just imposed whatever we wanted, but we did not. So we sat down with each one and we worked out an agreement with each bargaining unit. And it was high pressure because we were funded by the city of Boston. And so we were, negotiating with Boston Teachers Union, with the city of Boston there as well. So I've had that experience, and I've learned over time that, it's better to don't go in with a stubborn mind. Go in willing to work and willing to meet people halfway. So to answer your question, I love it.
Thank you. Our next question comes from trustee Mrs. Casagrande.
Sorry, I was still taking notes.
Okay, and I can get some water too.
Mr. Shackelford, what do you foresee as items the superintendent should do versus delegate versus lead? And please provide examples.
Superintendent should lead the district. The superintendent should set the vision. Superintendent should lead by example. The superintendent should follow up. What should the superintendent do? Superintendent needs to go out and meet with the buildings, meet with the principals, go out and meet with the board members. Delegate to the cabinet members. You have experts. You have Mrs. Less, who's an expert in business and finance. You have Mr. Chatfield, who's an expert in operations. You have Ms. Kachansky, who's an expert in instruction. So you allow them to run their buildings, run their departments. But then as a leader, you hold them accountable. You meet with them. You have cabinet meetings. But as a superintendent, you're the face. You are standing and you are supporting your team, your district. You're fighting the fight when necessary. You are doing all of those things that is necessary to make sure that this district puts its best face forward, and we're telling our story and making sure that Walt Lake is seen in a most positive light.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Vice President, Mr. Siegler.
What unique skills or leverage could you bring to this position, and how will Walt Lake Consolidated Schools be served by this? Please provide examples of how you've leveraged these skills.
So I've kind of talked about each one of these in this interview, but what I will bring to you is a spirit of getting it done. So I talked about, needing that as a teacher, we needed more common planning time. So I went to my principal, said, here's a plan, we got it done. Superintendent came and said, I need you to go over and transition school to a K-8. Went over, we got it done. Superintendent said, reinvent your buildings. I said, we need a university middle school for our high-performing students, performing students, excuse me. She said, gave me a thumbs up, we got it done. Went to Boston, the Commonwealth said, you need a plan for this school. We created a plan, we got it done. I took on diversity, equity, and inclusion in my building. We got it done. So much so that the district tapped me to not only lead that, but lead other areas as well. So I will bring that spirit of understanding that there may be some concerns, seeing a problem, creating a plan for that problem, collaborating with others, and we just get it done. And I will do it with a level of energy and excitement. And I want to bring that energy, and I hope that energy and excitement is contagious. I want every single board member, when I walk in the room, feel that energy and excitement, because we are going to get it done.
Thank you very much. As we wind down our time together, would you like to leave us with any closing remarks or thoughts?
Absolutely. So as I talked about before, this particular district, this particular job intrigued me. It spoke to me because of what I saw in your profile. But I think what really tipped the scales for me because I've driven around Walled Lake, gone to some schools on the weekend with my girls. Wanted to really get a feel for Walled Lake. And so I got a good feel for it a couple weeks ago when you guys were holding a special board meeting. So I tried to sneak in. It's hard for me to sneak anywhere and sit right in the back there. You guys were holding a meeting about your sinking fund. And I watched as we had a parent come up, and she was against it. And I watched you guys, this board, Ms. Kaplan, I'm going to call you the pitcher because you threw a couple softball questions out there, and Ms. Les and Mr. Chatfield answered those questions. And they really took the time, you all took the time to explain. Mr. Peterson, there was a couple times where you kept trying to get in and trying to speak, and you couldn't get in. I think about 3 or 4 times you couldn't get in, but you finally got in. Ms. Casagrande, you talked about how there was some bus washing thing that you didn't understand, but you went over and you talked to Mr. Chapman, you had an understanding of it. Mrs. Van Leeuwen, I think you talked about this being a donor district. And I think, Mr. Titus, you kind of chimed in on that as well. And I watched that, and I walked out, and I was amazed at how you guys took a situation, you took the opportunity to really break down what a sinking fund is, why it's important. Mr. Chatfield talked about the list of things that are on that needs to happen in the district that will probably never, ever get done all at once. But I was just amazed. And so when I talk about, and you'll see in my 100-day plan, we talk about the culture of we. You guys displayed that night. You displayed the culture of we, the power of working together. Now, whether or not you changed that parent's mind, I don't know. But, however, I give you guys credit for taking the time to really try to help her understand. So as I walked out to my car, first song that came up was a song on that said, "I'm in love." Like, well, I'm in deep like with Walled Lake right now. Next song that came on after that was "Ain't No Stopping Us Now." And I just said, something's speaking to me. So I want to tell you guys, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to talk with you about my experiences and how my experiences can be beneficial to Walled Lake schools. And I'm hoping that I will have the opportunity to expound on some of these in a further interview. But if not, I want to thank you all, and I want you all to know that you have an outstanding district, and I'm not just saying that because I'm interviewing, but you do have an outstanding district, and I would be honored to lead as your superintendent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shackelford. We appreciate your interest in our superintendent position. The board has interviewed a number of candidates, and we will contact you if you are selected as a finalist. Thank you very much for coming, and we enjoyed meeting with you this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, for our audience here, if you could please complete your feedback forms and hand them in to Mr. Bennett or Mrs. Sobel.